So this is the homecoming discussion on the future of architectural education. I'm David Theodore. I'm the new director of the Peter Guo-hua Fu School of Architecture. I'm sitting in the director's office, which is surprisingly clean. Thank you. And I think we should just chat a little bit. So Amale, what's up? I hear you have a accreditation visit this week.
We do. It ended yesterday, so you're catching me fresh and happy. Knock on wood. I mean, it went really well. But you know, it's very interesting. I don't want to. Should I just jump in, or I can share a few things? Okay.
Just jump in.
Sure. So, you know, accreditation in the US has decided to be virtual for the next 3 years. So it really sets a different tone in terms of how you represent the culture of a place as, you know, distinct from another place, even though the grid is the same everywhere, the Zoom grid. You know, we put a lot of efforts in, we built a whole website to have the student work there really accessible. We made videos, you know, that conveying the feel and atmosphere is difficult to do. At the same time, I was pleased that actually some of the spirit of the school came through. A lot of the focus on issues of diversity of culture, social engagement, climate issues, you know, these things came through. We still got dinged on I don't know, some building professional business, you know, a few things. So specifications, I think we keep failing. But I honestly, I didn't know what to expect, and somehow it's interesting to find ways to now translate culture differently through this kind of virtual medium and maintain, I think, the notion, and I think I was happy to hear the committee was very supportive of this idea that yes, we are all meeting these requirements, but no, we should not all become the same. We're in different cities, in different places, a different student body, a different, you know, faculty, and more than ever, I think we need a difference in perspective. So that was well received and supported.
So Amale, I didn't say, but you are the Dean of the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, all three. And you've been doing that for how long?
7 years.
7 years.
7 years, yeah.
So again, thank you. It's kind of crazy that it's me moderating the discussion when you all have so much more experience than I do. So really, really lucky to have you to be here and speak about it. But maybe can I do the same thing with you, Marc? And I know, Marc, that you are no, I don't know what you are exactly. You're the director of the, sorry, let me read it from your website so I don't get it wrong. Head of the architecture program, the design school at Arizona State University. And we know each other because we have an M.Arch degree together from McGill. And you're not doing accreditation, but you're doing something much harder, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, a lot has happened in the past few years, obviously, but Arizona State is a very different university than anywhere I've ever been, and it has a mission of inclusion and impact, and it's incredible how that has affected every program. We are now 140,000 students at ASU, so 140,000 students, and that doesn't include K through 12 learners or lifelong learners, which are about 50,000 people taking courses. So the impact is kind of ridiculous. And what was interesting is when I arrived at ASU, the faculty was sort of on a tipping point, and we have decided to go all in on the mission. And so we're basically designing a program that is radically inclusive We've increased our numbers from 350 students 3 years ago to 1,000 right now. We launched a new curriculum this semester, both online, undergrad and grad. And we're teaching 330 freshmen or first-year students with 3 faculty. So we're radically changing how we teach. We are completely rethinking how architecture can exist in a university setting. It would be great if we could have 10% of ASU students taking an architecture class. That's our goal. So it's 14,000 students in architecture. So it's crazy. I mean, it's exciting. It's exhausting, but it's a really interesting moment right now. And I think that, you know, in 5 years, when all the curriculum has settled into place, we'll be able to kind of, you know, sort of put our heads above all this and say, like, what happened? You know, how are we doing? And really reassess. But we have a really amazing commitment by our faculty to support students and to really, really like genuinely be inclusive. We don't have a milestone, et cetera. So it's been an interesting couple of years here, but like I said, it's exhausting. So still standing most of the days, but it's been good. It's fun.
Yeah, I find that we've actually been decreasing how many students, not because it's a plan. So the idea of tripling is quite frightening. And thanks, Marc. Lisa, can I do the same with you? Just an introductory remark. You are Associate Dean in the School of Architecture at University of Manitoba. And we didn't quite overlap at McGill, did we? Or did we as students?
I think almost every time, not as students, but I think every time I was there, I probably crossed you in the hallway. So yes, Lisa Landrum, Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Manitoba, which is in the very center of Canada in a city called Winnipeg. And these are the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples. And homeland of the Métis Nation, and we're very proud to be on Treaty 1 territory, proud and humbled to be on this land. And I have, for those of all of the Canadians in the call will know what today is. It's a new federal holiday. It's the first time that the holiday has been celebrated in Canada. It used to be called Orange Shirt Day in honor of a residential school survivor who wore an orange shirt to school that day and had to remove it immediately and endured the humiliation of that and survived the trauma, effectively cultural genocide in Canada. So today is a federal day of national truth and reconciliation to help all Canadians, you know, reconcile ourselves to move forward in partnership with our Indigenous communities. So I'd say at the University of Manitoba, we are actually in a unique position to help advance truth and reconciliation. We're the Faculty of Architecture here. It's unique in a couple respects. One is it's the 3rd oldest program in Canada after the University of Toronto and McGill, and we're the first accredited program, the first school of architecture in Western Canada. We are at the geographic center of North America, and we also have all 4 professional design and planning programs. So architecture, city planning, interior design, and landscape architecture, and a very large undergraduate program of environmental design, which to some extent feeds those graduate programs, but then those environmental design students also go all over the world with very diverse career trajectories, which we're proud of. On the point about Indigenous empowerment and reconciliation, I will put a couple links in the chat because we're incredibly proud of our students who just 2 years ago founded the Indigenous Design and Planning Students Association. They published a book just this past winter called Voices of the Land, which includes the work of 16 current students and now recent graduates of Indigenous backgrounds, including also recent alumni from the school. And just before and over this summer, they gifted to us a series of calls to action, calling on our faculty, fellow students, and educators to help move forward in partnership with Indigenous students and partners implementing the change that needs to happen in all of our schools. And we are in the slow process of having those conversations about how to implement such initiatives. So that is maybe a general introduction. And I think maybe, David, part of the reason why you have me here is because 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, I led a conversation with all the architecture schools across Canada called the Canadian Architecture Forums on Education. And there were 5 forums at 5 different schools of architecture. And there was a special event as part of that initiative, a nation-to-nation conversation led by Indigenous school students here at the University of Manitoba, but also involving Indigenous students from the other schools of architecture, which was quite powerful. And of course, Anne Bordelot, who is also a graduate of the History and Theory program at McGill, as the chair of CCUSA, the Canadian Council of University Schools of Architecture, was also instrumental in making that happen. And Amale, just to give you perspective, and Marc, you know this, but Canada, we're a big country to the north, but we only have 12 schools of architecture, which is an amazing opportunity, because it means that we can actually come together, normally sit around a table together. You know, in the last few years, it's been on Zoom calls, but it means that we can actually strategize initiatives collectively. And these cafe conversations, it was kind of remarkable in several ways, but one of the ways that I found to be most transformative and timely, given everything that happened over the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matters movement, and now with the proper acknowledgement of our Indigenous peoples in Canada, that the Cafe project, it empowered the student groups who were already there in formation, but it gave them a platform and to speak to one another across the schools. So we all know how much social media has taken off recently, how articulate and right on the students are, their initiatives. So it was a platform that fostered that. And then with the whole pandemic shutdown, the proliferation of social media, it really, I think helped those student groups take off. And now, I think the schools in many ways are trying to keep up with the student initiatives, and we're trying to do everything we can to help them with that.
So thank you, Lisa. That makes a kind of nice relationship between those 3 things. I just have to say, though, that Amale knows Canada very, 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 very well. You're coming to do some jury work here as well, Amale?
I am, and I was just in Montreal, finally visiting my family at the end of August. I'm very eager to reconnect even more, to be honest. Yeah, I'm on the Filles Contemporaines international competition jury, which a lot of people are excited about, as am I, for Montreal, and RAIC jury for an international award. So it's great to be part of kind of all of these sort of initiatives.
Yeah, it's great to reconnect, for sure. So what I meant by they neatly fit together was, Amale, you talked about the importance of being able to keep the identity of individual schools, a kind of individual cultural identity. And then Marc, you mentioned radical inclusion. So not just inclusiveness or trying to include representatives, but like how radical can we be about this? And then Lisa, you did those 2 things together. You identified University of Manitoba as trying to move to some specific form of inclusion that would then become the kind of banner of how the school identifies itself. There's a kind of underlying question in all of those moves that I'm just going to put under the banner of studio culture. So where are you at with studio culture? For example, this year with the pandemic, in order to open, our studios are not open 24/7. They're open from 8 till 8. And yet, of course, if I go there at midnight, there are still students in there because it's not a police state. It's just they're closed. And then all of the pre-pandemic reasons why studio culture is maybe not the best way to be teaching people. And yet within the university, that's kind of how we identify architecture differently from other faculties. Where are we at with that, Marc? How does that fit with radical inclusion studio culture?
Yeah, so I'm of the generation that had, drafting board in my studio. I had a Line. I had to be in studio because I didn't have that stuff at home. I also had the privilege of not having to work outside of studio. I played soccer in school, so I had that as a other thing, which was a great distraction. But studio culture kind of happened by default. So the late nights which weren't always healthy, but the collaboration, camaraderie, all that stuff happened by default, right? And that's just, it was a kind of tradition. And you had the unhealthy culture of, not enough sleep, of, all sorts of other things that happened. But, there were good things that came out of it. But again, it was by default. And so we have a school building that is completely full on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays from 1 to 6, and has been in previous years totally empty on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and pretty much on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. So we don't really have a culture here of making. We don't have a culture of being in studio all night. And mostly that comes from our student demographics. A lot of our students are working. Our students have families. Our students are not 18. Our students are a different mix of people, right? So a lot of students are at home. They work on their computers. We have making laboratories that are used, but it's not something that's necessarily used throughout the day and night, right? It's, you come in and you print something. So one of the conversations we've had is, how do you have culture within the studio time? So actually create opportunities for collaboration, create opportunities where there's peer-to-peer learning, create opportunities where students are engaging with each other, intentional, that has the same effect as a studio culture that I was used to, but without the negative staying up all night and not eating and all that other stuff. So we're trying to engineer it within the studio itself. And what we've talked about in the first years is actually designing success. So most programs design failure. So you basically are setting a student up to fail by the review process, by the crit process. It's not typically a productive process. So we're trying to think about how students, pass in work, it gets reviewed, then they have an opportunity to pass it in again. Thinking about how students can not pay a ton of money to be in studio. Our studio right now costs $60 in extra. We bought everything in bulk. So it's only $60. Years in past, it was $500, $600. So trying to really think about the student perspective and how we engineer the courses, knowing that they're not going to be there all night. And one of the issues with growing so quickly is that our facilities have not changed, and they're not going to change. So we're not getting a new building anytime soon. So we've had scheduling, rethink how we use classrooms, rethink how we use studios. And we've formed a much more collaborative environment in the sense that students don't get an individual desk. They work around larger tables. And so the architecture of the studios has even changed to really, it's something, that we have to kind of design this now. It's not something that's going to happen by default.
That's super. Yes, we will talk more about that. As I say, we've gone down at McGill in how many students we have, and
it sounds like you have space. We'll send some students up your way.
Yeah, we really do. But this year, with trying to reopen in the pandemic, it has shrunk the space magically all over again. So but it's the future of education. So in the future, yes, we need your advice, your experience. Lisa, the same kind of question. How does studio culture evolve with a deep commitment to truth and reconciliation?
Yeah, slowly and probably with a few mistakes along the way, but through conversation with diverse communities. I'd say here we've always had a very strong commitment to studio culture, and hands-on making is something that's very core to our school. We have excellent workshop facilities. One of the things, and maybe just a couple comments, like reflecting also on the pandemic teaching that I imagine are going to be carried forward. The accessibility to the interchanges via this format is great and can be more expansive. So for instance, in our region, we have students coming from very rural areas and all from the north, and there are areas that we would like to reach out to more. So there's potential for more engagement in this way with remote communities. At the same time, though, that relies on infrastructure, accessibility, and we all know from our own homes, you know, how many glitches there can be with connectivity. So that is amplified with remote communities, and we need to catch up with the infrastructure to make accessibility possible there. But also with the conversations, we're able to bring in, and we've all discovered this, we were able to bring in guests from afar, someone otherwise you might not have the budget to fly into a conversation. Now you can have them Zoom in, so we can bring in, you know, very appropriate individuals who can speak to topics in the studio. And I know that several colleagues and students have been inviting the Indigenous designers and planners from across Canada and elsewhere in the world into studio reviews. So that's very positive. I think the engagement in the forum has been interesting. We've probably all discovered how engaging the chat function can be for students in the exchange of ideas. But then also particularly this term with our opening up of hybrid studio environments, we're seeing more lands-based teaching, field trips, outdoor education, working in situ. So we've always had a tradition of having an urban media lab for our incoming undergraduates where they're meeting in the city and working intensely in the city environment for a week. We're having more of that now in various studios. And we also have specific lands-based teaching that is happening and being led by Indigenous scholars and also by student members of our IDIPSA student organization. So more lands-based teaching is something that I see as a very positive trajectory.
Okay, I'm kind of familiar with Winnipeg, so some of those terms and ideas are ones that have been going on for decades, it seems to me. What do you think is happening in the, like, how does that affect directly architecture and studio culture? So for example, my sister for a long time was the kind of intake person at Red River College for students coming from the north. So those are kind of very familiar talk to me, which hasn't really changed anything, despite that we've had programs like that. So is there something about architecture that you think really addresses truth and reconciliation? I mean, there might not be, but is there something there that is directly applicable?
Well, the lands-based exchange, I think, is only in its third or fourth year for our undergraduate students. It happened once or possibly twice before the pandemic. It was canceled, and now we have more events going forward. So this is a new initiative. The Indigenous scholar and assistant professor, Sean Bailey, was hired only recently as a cross appointment with engineering. I think he's going into his third year or fourth year. And the ADIPSA-led programming is all, for sure there have been various initiatives happening for a while, but these are being more directly implemented now into decisions made in the delivery of the content of studios and other courses.
So Amale, we met in studio the very first day of the first class of architecture school. So in some ways we share the beginning studio culture together, but you've taught in a lot of different places and been a student in other places, and now have been trying, as I understand, one of the first things you did at Columbia was to change the studios. So where are you at with studio culture these days?
Yeah, in fact, David, I was remembering, I mean, for me, I learned from you, I learned from my classmates, really going through architecture school. I mean, it really was, David would walk around and look at your drawing and, you know, it'd be late and, you know, under a deadline, like, why is the column like inside and not touching the wall. No, because you could do mise or you could do, you know, and he would, and I have a deadline tomorrow. I'm just trying to finish, you know, but that level of exchange, I think, is invaluable. And but you know, when I became dean, because I was very much, you know, I was coordinating core 2, so I was very, you know, I came from a very internal dean, very, very anchored in the curriculum of the architecture program. And yes, the first thing was to transform studio, to move from the kind of individual units, and as Marc said, you know, like where everybody was like behind a sort of little wall of personal sort of manifesto, to shared, you know, reduce the individual kind of space to allow for meeting tables, making tables, you know, the idea that studio is really open, it's a collaborative space, and doing that both physically and spatially, but also inserting within the studio, you know, instead of just 3 days a week of studio, there's one afternoon where all the studios come together for a lecture or for a talk or for, you know, so that there is more intersection, and it's not like a bubble within a bubble where every studio is separated from another studio, and so these were both spatial, cultural changes, structural changes to the curriculum in supporting the other sequences, you know, technology, visual studies, history, theory, making them as important as studio, not thinking that studio is the ultimate integrator, but rather you have now architecture students who really want to hybridize visual studies and tech, or who want to do a dual degree with planning or real estate, or, you know, so I think the richness of architectural education, yes, studio is central, but there are all these threads now that students are taking and weaving with other threads to kind of create, I think, new forms of practice. So studio culture in that sense was part of a wider collaborative the design of a more collaborative culture that allows kind of different kinds of integration. And very early on, you know, I would have meetings with students and we would talk about health and wellness and the kind of, you know, moving from the super competitive spirit to be more collaborative, to be more respectful, and so we had these kinds of, you know, pen down, you know, faculty, you know, you had to put your pen down and go home. Now, not everybody did it, but to kind of support that sense that even though, you know, as a student, you know, those were my favorite times, but I think not being pressured, you know, to do it. And so, you know, all of these things, and, you know, these things, these considerations, you know, intensified under our kind of anti-racism action plan, looking at kind of changing the kind of competitive spirit, you know, all of these questions came to the surface and intensified. The faculty came together, we created a core course now, it's called Common Circle. So when our students arrive, you know, it really talks about the kind of diversity of cultures and backgrounds and perspectives, and that all our students bring to the school, and how we value them, and are able to have difficult conversations. And so this all impacts this, you know, whatever student culture is, you know, presumably that's the hope, right? That there's a kind of transformation. And I think there's also the question of waste and model making, and working with the maker space to identify how, you know, students are very concerned about what they're using. There was one exhibition one year where the students didn't put up a show, they just put up like all the materials that you would need to buy to make models. And we're supporting model making more also financially, like if you know, because there are discrepancies and inequities in who gets to build, you know, a great model, etc. So being aware that this transpires, I think, has really come to the fore. And with the kind of remote, you know, I think it, of course, both, you know, as Lisa said, you know, there's a chat, there's like the mini group, there's the fact that you can sketch. I mean, I've never seen reviews where reviewers are more engaged with the drawing. I mean, usually they're just talking to the wall or talking to each other, but here, like, suddenly it's in your face. So there are very, very, positives to this experience. At the same time, I think inequities also emerged. When we shut down the school, we gave out all the computers, right? Just take them, because we couldn't take. We figured out Adobe licenses. Because one of the equalizer. So the flip side is the equalizer of coming to a space and being provided with a computer is that you're all in it together, and there's no one person doesn't have a good internet, one person is in China, one person and that sense of space being together in place as an equalizer, I think, is really important. So where we're at now, and in all, I think in all fairness, while we didn't see, I certainly didn't see, or the faculty didn't see a sort of drop in academic excellence, whatever that means, like in the kinds of work that was produced. On the contrary, that was amazing work. The social connections, the friendships, that was really hard, the coming together. And over again, we heard students feel, isolated. And I don't know if we can engineer. I think space does do something for us, right? We're architects, the kind of serendipitous encounters and so right now I can't, we're really happy to be back in person. I can't say that we're not. And, but there is an ask towards flexibility, which is the same ask that many offices are asking, right? So what is it that space and being together, enables that the virtual cannot? And what does the virtual do really well that we can support? That interface, that mixing between those that are in person and those that are remote has been the most difficult interface. And so we really have not, like, it works really well if you're all remote, and it works really well if you're all together in person. But bringing the two together, I think that is a long way to go still. And I think that's the challenge moving forward, because if you are speaking about the kinds of flexibility that I think everybody would like to strive for, we're going to have to figure this out as architects. And so there's a role there as well.
Marc, you actually introduced me to Zoom through the Journal of Architecture Education long before the pandemic. And I remember coming back to the school, like maybe we had to do job searches or something. And I said, hey, let's get Zoom. And the university said, no, like, why would you need this thing? And then, 6 months later, everybody needed Zoom. So you have a little bit of experience on this flexibility and how the remote works. Is it solved as a problem for you, ASU?
I'm not sure it's solved. I think it's been reframed as a problem. And, ASU does a lot of things really well. It doesn't do a lot of things really well either, just like most universities, but it works differently than a lot of places. So Michael Crow, who's the president, who actually came from Columbia, is just, I think, one of the most important disruptors of higher education. And it's a very, very top-down place, which, and maybe ruffles some faculty, because this idea of faculty governance really doesn't exist here. It's very corporate in many ways. And that has some negative side effects, but some positive things are that, people like Michael Crow see something like Zoom and it gets implemented. Like, it's a good tool, right? We're a global institution, we're a global enterprise. How do you connect people globally in new ways? And Skype wasn't quite working very well. Zoom came around. We bought into it very early, like way before the pandemic. And the board that you referenced, David, the JAE, was a board that I was the editor of for about 8 years. And we would meet annually, like twice a year. And the meetings were super important, right? And, David, you can maybe add to this, but the board culture was really important to me. And it was important to bring everyone together, to have dinner. Every annual board meeting, we would have dinner. And that was really important to kind of get together to create culture. But a couple of, actually probably 4 years ago or so, 1 or 2 members couldn't make the meeting. And so we Zoomed in and we were actually using it. And you had a computer at the end of the table. So everyone's around a table, you have a computer, and there's a board member. there, and then we sort of text them at dinner, and that was the extent of it. So it kind of worked. You know, I mean, it was a pretty good thing for that. But the board culture existed prior to that. And I think that, you know, the studio that I was running the semester when the pandemic hit worked really well because we had a culture in the studio already established. And to then go online, what happened was you had these moments where I just leave the call on. I would step off, I would go off, and the students would stay on after the call. And there were these, you know, they'd go into breakout rooms and they'd have, you know, they talk to each other. So I do think there's something about having a culture existing that lends support and makes it more successful when you go hybrid. But I don't think it's solved. I think it's reframed, and I do think I'm very optimistic actually about it as an issue of access, really. Yeah. And for all the reasons Lisa's talked about, Amale's talked about, like I think it's great. So.
I thought you might be optimistic about it, but you kind of went beyond being optimistic about it, and it's back to this thing of how do you build up the cultural experience. Richard Schumer, who's the director of urban planning above us, he says they're having a slight problem this fall because the students who are in second year did their first year online. And he says that you can just actually see the gaps in their knowledge that were, as Amale, you were saying, were done by peer-to-peer learning in the first year studio. So there's suddenly things that you have to teach people that you've never had to teach them before because they kind of learned by being in the studio with the other students. So I'm interested to see if they figure out, like, if you're online, you have to actually teach people something that you don't have to teach them if they're all in the same room.
Yeah, David, I'm actually surprised to hear that. Our students are different than we were, you know, in school. Like, our students are digitally native. I was in a studio a couple of years ago, and I said, all right, we're going to break out into groups. The first thing they did was created Slack channels for each other. I'm like, really? You can just talk to each other. You're in studio, you know? But they just immediately whipped out their phones, and there was a Slack channel set up. And so the communication that happens, in studio, students are still, you know, tagging each other, they're Instagramming each other, they're commenting on each other digitally. So I'm surprised. I mean, I haven't really seen that in our, the students that were fully remote. It seems like a different culture than I'm used to, right? Like, I'm not on any social media, for example. And I still don't really like Slack. I don't know if you all use it, but I find it another thing to listen to or to follow. But our students, I think, are much better at forming communities in different ways than we did.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, well, maybe just to build on this as one of the points of enhancement that I saw coming out of these kinds of exchanges is in a way, the quality of student presentations increased, like, because there were so many sort of PowerPoint or planned presentations throughout the term, where even in what would normally be a very casual kind of desk critique or conversation, the students prepared a dozen slides. You know, they decided what they were going to say in advance. There was a sequencing of images and in verbal presentation. So there was an intertwining to a greater and richer extent, I found, of the thinking and the making, of the thinking and the visual, of the articulation of the ideas. You know, the good old theory and practice were really the thinking and the making were coming together in the presentations. The students had more chances to rehearse this throughout the year. So I found whereas, you know, in our school, you know, frankly, may have been behind the wave of this presentation style in the last decade, where, you know, we would still have students with a beautiful wall worth of work, and then they would stand up to speak and, you know, fumble a little bit in how to make sense of that beautiful wall of work. But in the format of having to present the sequence of images through an order in advance, they rehearsed and thought about the narrative and the sequence and the storytelling of their project. I found, and several colleagues found, to be quite strong, enhanced over the last year.
I mean, if I can just, you know, so I agree with all that's been said, but at the same time, I just, being together in a place, right? I mean, like every campus, whether it's more or less integrated in its surrounding or is anchored in a place. And actually, one of the biggest, well, I think recognition that we heard from the accreditation board is that the school had reintegrated its place in New York and in being part of New York and really engaging with the city and not just being a global node, you know. And I thought that was really important. One of the biggest asks from our students in the summer of 2020 was, we are not just in New York, we're in Harlem. There's a history to Colombia's presence in this place. And how does someone who comes from Shenzhen or from Tsinghua, understand the moment they land, on this place, and these are things that are very hard, I think, to do through social media. This kind of physicality, the power of the buildings and what they represent and what you want to undo, and its architecture. And I just the craving that our students have had and the joy of being back together in studio it's been, it doesn't mean that it's not hybrid. I think there's no going back. It's going to be hybrid. We have to figure it out. It has to be flexible. We need to make sure that it serves increased access and doesn't intensifies inequities. And, but we're going to figure it out. But I still, the accident of encounter is something that's hard to design. Where and I think that's where the idea of common circle and that course came along, to really think, okay, what is a few shared points that we can, tools that we can bring to the fore, and so that it just, when we all went remote, I felt that the school fragmented, and it took incredible energy to say, no, we're in this together. We're not all the same, and we have to figure out our differences. But to keep, it was this kind of explosion, and so I think being together in place is still crucial, I think, and recognizing that place has its own history.
We unfortunately don't even have that much time left. Feels like we're just getting started. I'd like to ask people who are watching to put questions in the chat. We can monitor those questions. And I have at least one other kind of big topic that I'd like at least initial reactions to. So please, if you're listening and you have a question for one person or in general that you'd like some response to, please start putting them into the chat.
So Amale, really quickly while we're waiting for some questions, when studio started this semester, I walked around all the different studios just to welcome the students, say hello, introduce myself to some people who I'd never met, faculty that I hired remotely, it's very awkward. But there were so many students that came up to me and just said, thank you for getting back. Like, we need to be here, it's great. Many of those students are actually in hybrid studios. And yet the idea that they're in a place still was really, really important to them. So yeah, I agree. And you can't really convey 120 degrees on a summer night quite remotely. You know what I mean? It just hits you. It's great.
Yeah.
Or a minus.
Yeah, well,
minus Montreal style or Winnipeg style.
Winnipeg.
Yeah, I think Winnipeg wins there. -40 is something else. Yeah.
Yeah, we have kind of structural problem too with French and English, which the school is trying to figure out. All of McGill is trying to figure out, and that definitely has to do with, you have to kind of come here and see how funny it is to buy your Q-tips in a pharmacie instead of wherever you buy them from, wherever you're from. It's surprising how unsettling it can be that it look American in some ways and it's not be American for many kinds of people. There seems to be a hand up. Did you want to speak your question? Is that Jean Dufresne?
Hey, David. Yeah, if it's possible.
Sure.
It's a little easier than typing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Well, first off, David, congratulations. And Amale, it's nice to see you. I don't know if you remember, but you were like a year or two ahead of me. But I'm in Chicago now, I have a small firm. And to Amale's point, I think a sense of space is really important. We're super excited that our team is back in the office. Difficult. It's a difficult thing I find on all of our projects obviously are group projects, like everybody participates. To do that and to be able to do it productively and efficiently remote is very difficult. But again, to sort of tie that into the Slack conversations, and in terms of to Lisa's point of having slides and being well prepared, I completely agree. I think when we Zoom our presentations to our clients, it's a lot easier. They're not in a room with us. They're not looking at different things. We have 100% focus on the screen. However, we find that our teams, to Marc's point, they're in the same studio and they're slacking to each other. We find them that they're texting to each other and they're 4 feet apart. It somehow doesn't prepare them to have conversations on job sites. It doesn't prepare them for the spontaneous phone call from a client. And they don't want to use a phone for the sake of having a conversation. It's about texting. They want to email everything, even if we tell them this is a phone call conversation, not a 6 email exchange. So how do you sort of prepare students for that sort of aspect of real life and real sort of spontaneous exchanges and exchanges of ideas when they seem to be growing more and more comfortable or even uncomfortable with the face-to-face stuff in such a digital based environment that, the contractors are still older. Staff are also older. A lot of the professors I had at McGill are still there, and how do they adapt to something like that?
I'm going to jump in first because I think that very few of the professors you had are still here. We've had like 75% turnover in the last 10 years, and we have 5 hires coming up in the next couple of years. I think that's not quite true. I had a situation where I was talking to the student society. So there's a graduate student society rep and an undergraduate student society rep. The graduate student society rep remembers getting her first cell phone. The undergraduate person doesn't remember life without a cell phone. So that change is happening as everyone is saying. So some of it is just the passage of time. I don't really think it's up to architectural educators to make time go faster, if you see what I mean. And a lot of it is going to be for the professionals to know that they're bringing people in who, as Marc said, are digitally native. I don't know if anyone has more specific, like, do you have a class on teaching people how to have telephone calls at Manitoba?
Not to my knowledge, but I haven't looked at the full list of electives recently. But I think this is a really excellent point. And I think the issues of, a kind of in situ conversational, compassionate mode of empathy, of listening is really key. The capacity to listen, to hear, to think, to understand, to pause, to read a situation, whether you're on site or in a situation amid, strangers and friends on a call together. All of these modes of communication are so important and need to be rehearsed and practiced throughout the project. I mean, one of the skills that I think we've probably all experienced is that, like, the skills of moderation or chairing a meeting, ensuring equitable representation among speakers, making sure you call on everyone, rehearsing in advance for such things. These have been amplified in importance in hosting equitable conversations in this mode. And I think this is a great point of bringing it back to the studios and studio culture. Yeah, I've seen it happening, but I guess that's the point I just want to make. The setting up the conversations online are those communication skills.
Yeah, I think it's like it's with everything, right? I mean, there are things that we can we can teach, and there are things that we have to learn. And I think we have to acknowledge that change is happening. I mean, we have to learn from our students, we have to learn from our kids, anyone who's, and it's very, I think to David's point, it's going so fast. I mean, my daughter who's 11, it doesn't just text, she gets on Roblox and it's entire conversations. And she's like, so it's the voice is back. It's not just, it's like all over. It's like, but she's constantly in touch with her friends. I mean, it's amazing. And so I think we have to recognize that richness. And I think to Lisa's point, I remember when we started our practice, and even as teachers, I mean, we were terrible speakers, terrible. I mean, my first class was terrible, but you have to learn. I mean, we got coaches who were like, stop looking at your slides. 80% of communication is physical. And now we reconnected. We have an interview coming up and we're like, okay, how do you coach on Zoom? We're all staring at slides. And I think I think we have to continually learn and not say this mode is better than that mode. It's all modes, it's like drawing, right? There's not one mode better than another. We need to draw in all ways. And I think there's a lot of richness right now that we have to, and then when it's sometimes you're like, this is a phone call. It's not an email, it's not, and we have to say it as well. And I think that's part of what we do as educators, is step in when we think that something that is being lost is still valuable.
There's a question from Mary Jean.
Hi, you just said something very important, Amale. You said 80% of communication is physical. And that is absolutely true in our profession. That we, the way we listen to clients, the way we speak to clients, there's so much body language involved. And obviously our body language is very restrained in a situation like this. And it's even more restrained when we want to be looking at drawings and documents, because unlike the world that existed before COVID, where we sort of had sophisticated conference rooms where you could see the people around the table, but you could also present with models and point to things on the drawings. We're missing that now. And we haven't figured out how to bring those two things together again. You either have to be all virtual or all in the room. I mean, there's a huge advantage in that we have people around the world working on the same project. That's incredible. But there's just so much communication that we're missing. And there's so much informal communication that's missing. Just hearing a project architect yell at a contractor, or it's so restrained. So yeah, we have to get back in the room.
There's that seems to be just confirming the general things of the conversation. But does somebody want to respond to that in some particular way? Marc, do you have I think it'd be
I don't know. I mean, I don't think we're going back. I think that there's like your daughter, Amale, like her world is not your world when you're 11. My world as a 18 to 24-year-old architecture student is not the world of our students. And I can't teach the way I was taught. They're not learning the way I learned. I have to learn from them. We have to meet each other in the middle. And I think that it's not an either or situation. It's never going to be that way. It's never that simple. It has to be some sort of mixed solution. And if I can, if my lectures can be recorded and someone who has to drive 2 hours to get to class doesn't have to drive 2 hours to get to class, can hear that content and thrive, great. You know what I mean? Like, that's fantastic. Maybe that person stays in school, I had a student, really quick story. I had a student at Woodbury University where I taught in Los Angeles. And he was a graduate of Orange Coast Community College, lived down in Long Beach. And he didn't have gas money to drive up to studio. This was 5 or 6 years ago now. And so we made a deal that he would do remote crits, that saved him about 4 hours a day of commuting and a whole lot of money of gas, which he didn't have. that kept him in school. He graduated. Like that for me is a good thing, right? So I agree. It's important that we have person-to-person, in-person contact. Completely agree. But there are moments where, gosh, if that kid can stay in school, let's promote that. Let's support that. You know, he did not have access, and now he did. So for me, that's a win, right? So I don't know. I'm not ready to say we have to all get back. I think it's going to be a mixed world, and that's a good thing from my perspective. I think there's a hand up, David. Doug.
Yeah. Douglas McLeod.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Douglas McLeod. I'm the chair of the REIC Center for Architecture at Athabasca University. Athabasca is a totally online and virtual and open university, and I'm very interested in what Marc was talking about in terms of radical inclusion. And my question is really, does our traditional approach to teaching architecture have embedded in it structural barriers to inclusion? I would, from what I've seen over the last decade or so, we're looking at the way that, you know, semester systems and schedules and in-person classes actually exclude a lot of people from learning about architecture, and the ability, as Marc just said, to arrange so that students can be included. And also in terms of the studio culture, we also have to recognize that the aspects that are being lost when we pull people out of their communities and transport them to different cities, which radically, of course, increases the cost of an architectural education as well. So I wondered, as we're experiencing the pandemic and going online, if there's not another level of lessons that we could learn about how we need to change architectural education. Thank you.
Yeah. Marc?
Yes, I totally
Yes.
agree. I mean, we you know, we're at a university where the president calls himself a knowledge enterprise architect, right? And we have a university architect that deals with buildings, and we have a university architect, that's her title, and she deals with the architecture of the enterprise, like how the university is structured, how it moves forward, all these things. And I think we need to capitalize on that framing, right? We need the profession, right? We need to develop good future professional architects that are going to change our profession in good ways. That has to happen, in my view. But we also, I think, can educate more people. And this idea of if every architecture program taught 10% of their university, and it doesn't mean they're in the program, but if you had a class that people from engineering took an architecture class, or people from the humanities took an architecture class, I think it just raises the awareness of the value of the architect. And we're not doing that. We're like, from what we were doing at ASU, I can speak to that. We would take 200 first-year students. In the second year, dwindle that down, cut that down to 45 students based upon a GPA that was essentially a physics class, an English class, and maybe two architecture classes. And some general studies courses. It's crazy, you know. So students with a 3.8 were getting rejected, you know. It's insane. So we've completely gotten rid of that, and we are trying to think about how do you radically include anybody who wants to take architecture. Like, let's come on board, right? We have to change the way we teach studio. We have to change the way we use space. We have to change the way we schedule. The lockstep scheduling system that we typically have. If you miss one studio in the fall, you lose a whole year. Right? So why have that? Why not allow students to enter in January, right? If they're coming from community college. Like, community colleges in California, Florida, and Texas have fantastic architecture programs, really, really, really good architecture programs. And those students oftentimes go into a program and have to start in year one. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of time. We have to find ways of working together on this. And it seems, you know, like a huge opportunity for us to be relevant and have impact. So I agree with the previous comment.
Can I offer you know, I agree in many parts, but in other parts, I think the danger here is to say, you know, architectural education is expensive. Let's make it cheaper by making it all remote, making sure that, you know, the students can stay where they are, etc. part of the experience of traveling, encountering different places, different cultures. This is something we need to support. So if there's a problem with cost, schools need to bring the cost down to support education of more, to enable more students to become educated in architecture and not. So, you know, I like the entrepreneurial spirit is great, but also it cannot come at the expense of, I think, increasing financial aid and financial support. That is the biggest challenge of universities, is not just becoming accessible by becoming virtual. I think that has its own issues. It's becoming more accessible by bringing down the costs in other ways and supporting students better. So you know, that's the risk. Like.
Yeah, and I just say likewise that I agree with the caveat, and that has to do with place, as Amale mentioned, and the kind of value of embodied knowledge. I mean, how many meetings have we gone to and we leave and we can't remember which meeting something happened in because they all happened in this space at your dining room table or wherever you happen to be working. So being in the situation, I think many of us use the educational situation as a learning opportunity, which students go away with. And then also, I completely agree that the kind of architecture of the institution and the infrastructure that supports things like equitable timetables and availability needs to be tackled and taken on, but being mindful of the kinds of agreements that universities enter into with those tech companies that also introduce limitations and paywalls that become exclusionary. There's sometimes an illusion of inclusivity, but so long as you're signed on and you continue to pay the subscription. So I think that's also something that to be mindful of going forward.
So that was nicely done. Thank you. And you each got a last word, which was what I was hoping for at the end. It is 11:30. One note from the chat is that the research about workspaces might eventually filter in, and sometimes does, for better or worse, into how we're thinking about how it works in the university. And yeah, it is about the future for me at this point. It's exactly as you said, Marc, we can't teach the way we were taught. It's just impossible for this point. So it's kind of strange. And then Amale, we have to teach ourselves and learn from our students what they're going to need and so on. It's a very strange moment, but I'm really, really enthused to hear that there are ways forward. You're showing ways forward. You're showing that there's possibilities and different ways to think about it. And it's not just one. I take to heart, Amale, your point that the cultures of each school might be different. So for example, in Quebec, Marc, everybody comes from community college because we have the CJET system. So that it's not distinguished as it is. And that's a local situation, very different from what University of Toronto or Columbia has to do to get their students and so on. So I promised to end in an hour. It's 63 minutes. I hope that's allowed. Really, really happy to see you, each of you. Hope to see you in person soon. Marc, I probably won't for a while, right? Yeah.
No, we'll see.
We'll see. Lisa,
so,
Lisa probably will. And Amale, yeah, next time let's figure it out.
Definitely.
And really, really appreciate the hour today. Thank you. I'm going to hang around on the Zoom for a little while, as Marc was suggesting. That's kind of a good thing to do with these conversations. So if people who are listening want to stay and chat for a little bit, I'm perfectly happy to talk. But Lisa, Amale, and Marc, thank you, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone.
Good to see you both. Take care.
Yeah, likewise.
David, always good to see you. How was it to be director?
It's today it was, you know, pigeons on the windowsills, and it's just very strange.
Yeah. You've been at that school for so long. It's like, I mean, how's your mindset? I mean, you were a student there and you left and you came back, and you know, it's been a long time, you know. Is it strange to sit in that room? I think that room used to be a conference room, if I remember.
Yeah, so that in fact was one of the things I did first is to try to see if we could shuffle the rooms a little around, because we were doing different plannings for different pandemic scenarios. But in the end, yeah, this is the director's office, and this is where I am. But my favorite thing is, as you know, I have a certain way of asking questions about things. And as director, people try to answer those questions. It's really funny.
So I want to know if you're going to get a painting, a portrait of you in the wall. Is that in your plans yet? Well, or do you have to retire for that to happen? I want to see that happen, David. I'll pay for it.
two directors have not sat for their portraits, and the last director, Martin Bassani, did sit, but then rejected the portrait.
Oh no!
So we're 3 portraits down before we get to me.
I think it looks like Dave or Bruce, excuse me, has a question.
Yeah, I'm a graduate of 51 years ago, so all of what you spoke of is quite perplexing to me. I didn't even have a hand calculator when I was at school, but I find it really heartening to see your generation of directors taking over and full of wonderful ideas, which makes me feel quite optimistic about how the education is going to go in the future. So thanks so much for the input. I'm really, really excited.
Thank you. I have to say on a real quick personal note, I overlapped with both Lisa and David at McGill, and it's just amazing to see how much they've accomplished and like just what they're doing, and it's just I'm so happy for you both. It's really, really great to see. I mean, I remember being in the elevator with Lisa talking about like, oh my God, what is epistemology? Oh my God, like freaking out about these things. And and now all the work she's doing in Canada and the impact you have, it's just amazing. So I'm just so happy for you. It's great.
Oh, you're very kind, Marc. And there's many other worthy graduates in our midst in the call and across North America and elsewhere who are equally worthy to be here and are doing great things. Yeah, McGill is a great program.
All right,
David, I'll let you go. Congratulations, David. It's so great to have you leading one of the schools of architecture in Canada. And thank you everyone on the call. Marc, it's wonderful seeing you, and we'll be in touch.
For sure.
Thanks,
I'm going to take off as well.
Okay.
Good to see you. All right, take care.
See you, Marc. So Bruce, did you have a question?
Now, let me see now. I've got to get myself connected. Oh, I am connected. Okay. What was my question? Oh, well, no, I was sort of intrigued by somebody made a comment about how crits were destructive. And yet other people were saying how crits are very useful. And to me, the issue of crits being destructive had more to do with the critic than with the act. I had a couple of professors who were bluntly very, very negative about life, and they took it out on the students to the point that nowadays they wouldn't have been able to keep their jobs because they were so abusive. And yet, ironically, it was that abuse that we got that made us much more able to deal with clients who frankly aren't trained to be diplomatic at all times. And so it's a mixed bag, but I still think the crit is, because of the interchange between the teachers and the student group who are participating to a greater or lesser degree, is still, for me, perhaps the most valuable part of the teaching process.
Well, it's not that they need to be thrown out completely. It's just there are lots of things that you want to teach that aren't well taught in a review crit situation. And there are other forms of doing reviews of the work that are also better ways to evaluate the work. Like you still have to give students a grade, and is having them stand up and defend their work against verbal critiques the best way to evaluate whether they've learned something or not? It's just not, like, we wouldn't do that in a math exam, right? Where you project your math exam on a wall and have people critique the way that you went about solving the problems. It's just a very peculiar tradition in architecture and art school. And there are just other ways to do it. So,
but let's face it, it is a simulation of the real act of being a professional architect.
Well, so-
you know, dealing with clients and explaining a project and fielding their comments and encouraging their comments is a skill that you start to learn in the school environment, but you have to learn in practice. I agree with you. You can't just assign a mark from a crit. I mean, that has to come with more reflection on the part of the teaching group. The crit is the way that we as the student and later as the professional basically understand whether we're going in the right direction or not.
Well, there's just other ways to think of it. So for example, it's unlikely that the client will have the same kinds of criticisms that the student does. But Peter Collins had this book, Architectural Judgment. And what he was trying to say by the terms of architectural judgment is, does a student looking at their work have the same criteria for judging whether it's going well as the teacher? Does the jury member on a competition have the same criteria as judging for it's going well as the client, and so on? His argument was that there are different kinds of architectural judgments in different situations. So not being good as a jury member doesn't make you the good as a head of a firm when you're trying to judge the architecture. The other way to think about that is that most architects aren't in that situation of talking to the client and trying to persuade the client and presenting to the client. There are a whole bunch of other jobs that architects do in architect's office, and they may not need that skill at all to be very, very important members of architecture offices. So there's just a whole bunch of ways to move architecture projects along, and the crit is only one of them. So people have been developing many, many other kinds of ways to think of where you get, how students get feedback and in what forms, other than the crit.
Oh yeah, no, I don't disagree that there are other ways at all. But the crit, I still feel has a big role to play, and it's a part of our growing up process as students.
Part of it is celebration. So students have been working really, really hard. You want them to be able to talk about it in front of a large room and maybe have some champagne at the end.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, this has been a wonderful hour and more. So
thank you, Bruce. And I guess I'll close it down there. Thanks, everyone. I hope you do homecoming days regularly. There's lots of events going on as well. I only will be able to participate in very few of them, but enjoy. And hope to see you all in person soon enough.